Hello and welcome to ChurchTherapy.com's Pastor Training Videos. I'm Kristen Kinsevich, licensed mental health counselor on staff at East Coast International Church in Lynn, Massachusetts. Today we're going to be talking about the history of psychology and Christianity and how those two have blended together. Many of you have probably heard of biblical counseling and Christian counseling, and maybe you fall into one of those camps, or maybe you aren't sure what the difference is. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is in the beginning section of my book called On Edge, Mental Illness in the Christian Context. And also I found this reference book helpful. It's by David Powlison of the CCEF, and he wrote this book called The Biblical Counseling Movement. So I hope those resources can be helpful for you. So we're going to just talk a little bit about how psychology itself developed. Obviously, some of the things that we know today about psychology are fairly modern, and they haven't been around forever. Other aspects have been questions we've been asking for basically all of humanity. Things like, who are we, where did we come from, what's our purpose, that kind of thing. So really, modern psychology began as early as the Greek philosophers, when they were talking about humors. They were looking at personality types and really trying to figure out, why do we act the way we do? Why do some people act different from other people? And so they decided that there were some kind of fluids in the body that made a person act a certain way. And so we still use some of this language today: sanguine, choleric, melancholy. These were some of the things that they thought, these biles in the body that would create your personality, essentially. Then in the mid-1700s, phrenology came about, and that was this idea that there were some bumps on your head that could be kind of felt around and read, and you could find out more about why a person was acting unusually or mentally ill, as we would think of it today. And of course, we know they were very wrong about that, but they did start us off on a path of something very important, which was the brain has something to do with the way we act. And so that was an important contribution. Then in the late 1800s, William Wundt studied in a more scientific way. He was looking at how people learn and why people behave the way they do. And so now into the early 1900s, you get Sigmund Freud and the beginnings of behaviorism in the 1910s and 20s. And now we're starting with the scientific method, and we're really studying, how do people learn, what motivates people. Classical conditioning came along, which is really this idea that you can train a child or an animal to behave a certain way, pairing certain things. So Pavlov did a study with dogs, and he would ring a bell every time he was going to feed his dogs. And after a while, he was measuring the saliva of the dogs. He found that when he rang the bell, they would start to salivate. So they associated the bell with food. And so that's classical conditioning. It's just pairing responses. And so those are the kinds of things that were then being studied. Into 1952 is the first introduction of what we know as the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It is what clinicians use today to diagnose mental illnesses, and so things like bipolar disorder and depression and schizophrenia are in the DSM-4, and there's some research that backs that up, and both Christian and secular sources sometimes take issue with some of the research in the DSM. It's certainly not to be held up as the be-all, end-all of everything, but it does help classify symptoms. So you have these 10 things that are going on, and that puts you in a category or doesn't. So if you're dealing with someone who says they're depressed, but they don't meet these certain criteria, then they're not clinically depressed. And so it's a helpful guide for clusters of symptoms. So that's how we use it today. But that started in 1952, primarily for use in the military, studying PTSD in soldiers that were returning home. Now in the 1980s and 90s, there was a real surge of mental health programs, community mental health, really as state hospitals started to close, and people who would once have been hospitalized for their lives ended up now on the streets. A lot of homelessness was happening, and so they needed a response. How are we going to help these people integrate into society? And so a lot of community mental health programs emerged during that time. Now the 1990s to the present has seen a real shift in studying neuroscience and understanding how the brain operates. A lot of medications are new. Certainly there have been medications since the 50s or so, but newer medications with fewer side effects are now out, and that's really being studied. Genetics and the role of genetics in mental illness, and how genetics can even not necessarily have a concrete in stone this is what's going to happen in your life, but certain aspects of genetics can get turned on and off. So I might be born with a predisposition for depression, but if certain environmental factors don't kind of trigger that, I may never have it. And so there's definitely studying a lot of those things today and really trying to hone in on a lot more specific research to help support some of the clusters of symptoms that they list in the DSM now 5. DSM-5 is the current edition. And so that's really where we are today. Now, where does Christianity and you as a pastor, where would you fit into all of this? Really, there's not a lot of commentary on this modern view of psychology until about 1958. Clyde Narramore was kind of one of the earliest Christian psychiatrists, and he becomes well known for his statements that you could be a Christian and be a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And so this idea that you can accept certain aspects of psychology as a Christian was pretty bold of him to say, and many joined him in that. Certainly a lot of things that Freud and other psychologists were saying would go against the Bible, and so certainly Freud said that religion is the opiate of the people, so that's his view on religion. Carl Jung had archetypes that he presented as a theory, again, of why people are thinking the way they do. These are theories. There wasn't really scientific research that backed that up, and we can take the good from those things, some ideas that are helpful, and really reject some of the other things that don't fit into a biblical worldview. And so that's called integration. You're taking pieces of psychology that are either based in scientific fact or research, and then you're rejecting certain other things that are asking questions that the Bible already answers. Well, in 1970 or so, Jay Adams, who was a pastor, really came out against this idea of Christians accepting any part of psychology. He wrote Competent to Counsel, among other books. Maybe you've heard of that or read that. And really, he was saying pastors are equipped to counsel and guide their parishioners, and they don't need to be trained in psychology. And the Bible has been answering these questions for, centuries, and so we really don't need psychology. This doesn't help us in any way. And so he really launched the biblical counseling movement, and that is still common in pastor trainings today. There's been a little bit of a shift in even those who have studied under Jay Adams. The CCEF is an organization that Adams founded that now does include some aspects of psychology, particularly things that have been well researched. So there is a little bit more integration even in that camp. But really, in the 1970s, there became this tension. As colleges and universities, seminaries were creating counseling programs, studying psychology and theology, and merging them together into one kind of unified study, really taking the biblical underpinnings of a worldview and a view of persons and incorporating how we understand human behavior from a psychological point of view into that. That's that integration. And that was really at war with this other camp that Jay Adams had of the biblical counseling, where they were really rejecting psychology and saying, no, Christians cannot accept any part of psychology. And so really for the last 30, 40 years, there's been these two factions that have just hung out in Christian circles, and they haven't really gotten along, and they haven't really been able to communicate that well. Gary Collins tried to have some kind of corporate dialogues that didn't really go very well. And so there's been this divide, and so seminaries are churning out these Christian counselors who are going into private practice, who are available to churches. Certainly I'm working through churchtherapy.com to have some of those people come out of seminaries and get employed at churches to have their practices right there and be on staff at the church. But then there's others who, again, pastors who are still being trained in biblical counseling, who are really being taught to continue to reject psychology. And so here we are today. Again, I mentioned CCEF is kind of blending some of these things, and so there's some common ground now. But I think this is important, and the reason I did this training today was because I want you as a pastor to really have considered some of these questions and to really understand where we are at now with modern psychology. Certainly there is not a whole lot of psychoanalysis going on. That's what Freud was doing. That was a very different kind of treating someone than we have today. Certainly if you go to any kind of Christian counselor that's licensed, that takes insurance, they're going to have gone through some type of program that has trained them in psychology, and hopefully maybe some seminary background in theology as well. Unfortunately, some people who have gone through a seminary or are a Christian and have gone through a secular program don't necessarily work with the church in mind. So they're just in private practice, and they might see some Christians and see some non-Christians, and really they're just helping people kind of emotionally and with their mental health. And that's certainly good. Church therapy is really this model that I'm writing about and creating that's talking about how we can understand the person's discipleship and their emotional growth, spiritual growth, their mental health needs all in one, and really have a team approach. So the pastors and a counselor on staff, or counselors on staff, depending on the size of the church, can really work together to understand the whole person and to provide kind of a wraparound care for them. So that's really what my passion is, and I'm glad to share that with you today. Thanks so much for tuning in. See you next time.